On Tuesday, I had a 9-figure net worth, a jet on standby, and the world convinced I was a genius. By Friday, I was standing in my son's garage, asking him for a loan to keep the lights on. The architect of my empire and the demolitions expert were the same man, me. And this is the story of how I built a legacy, only to become the man who burned it to the ground. My name is Alistair Caldwell, and I am 72 years old. But the story I'm about to tell you begins when I was a boy, in a world that smelled perpetually of tanned hide, beeswax, and my grandfather's pipe tobacco. The business was called Caldwell Fine Leathers. My grandfather, Elias Caldwell, started it in 1948 in a small, dusty workshop behind our family home in a quiet English town. He was a craftsman of the old school. To him, every wallet, every belt, every handbag was a testament to patience. He'd run his calloused thumb over a line of stitching and could tell you, just by the feel of it, if the tension was a fraction of a millimeter off. He wasn't building a brand. He was building things that would last longer than he would. When he passed, my father, William, took over. Dad was a good man, a safe man. He honored my grandfather's traditions to the letter. He maintained the local client list, fulfilled the bespoke orders, and paid the bills on time. He ran the workshop with quiet dignity, content in his small corner of the world. The business provided for us. It was stable, respectable, and utterly suffocatingly small. I loved my father, but I couldn't bear his lack of ambition. I grew up in that workshop, but while he saw a finished product, I saw a world of untapped potential. I saw the name Caldwell, not on a small embossed card in a local shop, but on gleaming brass signs in the windows of shops in Paris, New York, and Tokyo. My father wanted to preserve a legacy. I wanted to build an empire on top of it. When I took the reins in my early 30s, the tension between his vision and mine became the central conflict of my life. I remember the day I presented him with my first real business plan. It was filled with market projections, designs for a more modern-looking product line, and a strategy for attending international trade shows. He looked over the documents with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, his face a mask of profound skepticism. He put the papers down on his old wooden desk, the same desk his father had used, and looked at me. "Alistair," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "quality is a quiet thing. It speaks for itself in the hands of the person who holds it. It doesn't need to shout across oceans. You start chasing volume. You start cutting corners. The moment you make 1,000 bags identical, you lose the soul that made the first one special." I told him he was wrong. I told him the world was changing, that craftsmanship and scale didn't have to be enemies, that we could share our family's quality with the world and build something truly great. He just shook his head slowly and said, "Be careful, son. A tree that grows too fast often has the weakest roots." That hunger to prove him wrong, to prove my vision was the right one, it was an inferno inside me, a feeling some of you watching might know all too well. Before I tell you how I landed that first game-changing contract, do me a favor and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far the story of Caldwell Leathers has traveled, even in its ashes, and if you're new here, perhaps consider subscribing to hear the rest of this cautionary tale. I poured every ounce of my energy and every penny of the company's modest savings into my vision. The first few years were brutal. They were a montage of rejection and exhaustion. I remember packing a dozen of our finest briefcases and handbags into 2 enormous suitcases and flying to a trade show in Milan. I couldn't afford a proper booth, so I had a tiny little table in a forgotten corner of the convention center. I stood there for 3 days, watching buyers from major department stores walk right past me without a second glance, heading for the big, flashy Italian brands. I'd spend my days smiling until my face ached, and my nights in a cheap hotel room, studying business magazines and trying to teach myself rudimentary Japanese for the Tokyo show next on my list. I faced rejection after rejection. My designs were too traditional. My brand had no recognition. My prices were too high for an unknown. My father's words about weak roots echoed in my mind every single night. There were moments I was so close to giving up, to calling him and admitting he was right. But every time I felt that despair, I would open one of the bags. I'd run my hand over the supple, full-grain leather. I'd hear the satisfying solid click of the hand-cast brass clasp. I knew the quality was there. I wasn't selling a lie. The world just didn't know it yet. My job wasn't to create quality, but to build a stage big enough for it to be seen. The turning point came not in Milan or Paris, but in New York. It was my last show of the year, my funds almost completely depleted. I was tired, disheartened, and ready to concede defeat. A woman approached my sad little table. She was impeccably dressed, sharp, and had an aura of importance that made my palms sweat. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she was the head buyer for one of the most exclusive luxury department stores on Fifth Avenue. She picked up a handbag, a classic satchel design I had subtly modernized. She didn't look at me. She just examined the bag with a forensic intensity. She opened it, smelled the leather, ran her fingers along the interior lining. She tested the zipper, tugged on the strap anchors, and scrutinized every single stitch. After what felt like an eternity of silence, she looked up and met my eyes for the first time. "Who does your stitching?" she asked, her voice clipped and professional. "My father, mostly," I replied, my voice cracking slightly. "And me." She nodded slowly, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in her eyes. "This is old world work," she said. "I haven't seen finishing this clean from a new brand in 20 years. That was it. That was the moment the door cracked open. She placed an order. It wasn't huge, but it was for her flagship store on Fifth Avenue. It was the validation I had been bleeding for. The day the first wire transfer from that store hit our company account, I just stared at the number on the screen. It was more money than the business had ever seen in a single transaction. It was the first real proof that I was right. I walked into the workshop and showed my father the bank statement. He stared at it for a long time, and then he looked at me. He didn't smile, not really. He just put a heavy hand on my shoulder and said, "Just remember where this comes from, Alistair. Remember the hands that made it." But I was already miles away. That first success was like a drug. It fueled my ambition into a raging fire. The bag sold out in New York. Eleanor doubled the next order. Other stores started calling. The press wrote a small article about a resurgent English heritage brand. Suddenly, I wasn't the desperate young man at the forgotten table anymore. I was a visionary. I secured our first round of real investment, expanded the workshop, and hired more artisans, whom my father painstakingly trained. Within 5 years, we went from a local secret to a name whispered in fashion circles. We had made our first million in profit, then our second. The feeling was intoxicating. I wasn't just my father's son running a workshop anymore. I was Alistair Caldwell, the man who was about to take a small family business and forge it into a global empire. I was standing on top of the world, and from that height, I couldn't see a single cloud in the sky. The decade that followed that first million was a blur of vertical ascent. It was less like climbing a ladder and more like being strapped to a rocket. The small article about a resurgent English heritage brand became a full feature in Vogue, then a cover story in Forbes. The name Caldwell was no longer whispered. It was spoken with a kind of hushed reverence in the circles I had once only dreamed of entering. We didn't just have a counter in a New York department store. We had our own flagship boutique on Bond Street in London, a gleaming temple of glass, polished oak and brass that cost more to build than my grandfather had earned in his entire lifetime. Soon after, another followed on the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris, then one in Ginza, Tokyo. I was no longer just the CEO. I was the creative director, the visionary, the brand architect. The media crafted a myth around me, the prodigal son who had taken his family's humble craft and spun it into gold. I started to believe it. I started to believe I had a Midas touch, that my instincts were infallible. The hard work and luck that had gotten me there were conveniently forgotten, replaced by a narrative of singular genius. My genius. The world affirmed it, so it had to be true. My life transformed into a series of beautiful, sterile tableaus. I moved my family from our comfortable home into a sprawling, modernist mansion of glass and white stone overlooking the sea. It was a magnificent piece of architecture, featured in magazines, but it never felt like a home. It was a statement. It was cold. We had a staff who anticipated our every need, yet I felt a profound sense of isolation growing within its perfectly manicured walls. I traded my reliable sedan for a fleet of luxury cars. I bought a private jet because, as my new CFO put it, time is your most valuable asset, Alistair. You can't be waiting in commercial terminals. I flew to Milan for lunch and was back in London for dinner. I was living a life I couldn't have even properly imagined as a young man smelling of leather dust, and yet the joy of it was thin, ephemeral. It was the thrill of acquisition, not of possession. My father watched all of this from a distance. He was retired now, but he still visited the main workshop, now a state-of-the-art facility, once a week. He would walk the floor, not like a founder, but like a ghost. He'd touch the rolls of leather, nod to the older craftsmen he'd trained, and watch the younger ones working with a sort of detached sadness. He never criticized me directly, but his silence was a judgment in itself. I remember walking him through our new corporate headquarters, a skyscraper of steel and tinted glass in the heart of the city. I showed him the marketing department, the global logistics hub, the boardroom on the top floor with its panoramic view of London. I was bursting with pride, seeking his approval, the one thing my millions couldn't seem to buy. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city below. "It's very impressive, son," he said, his voice quiet amidst the opulence. "But where do you make things?" The question was so simple, so profoundly out of place in that temple of commerce, that it caught me off guard. "The workshops are outside the city, Dad. It's a much bigger, more efficient operation now." He turned from the window to look at me. "I see the reports, Alistair. I see the name everywhere. But when I visit the workshop, I don't smell the wax anymore. I smell chemicals. I see men operating machines that do the work of 20. The hands are gone from it." I felt a flash of anger, the old insecurity flaring up. "That's called progress, Dad. We can't build a global brand using 18th century methods. We'd be a museum piece." He simply shook his head. "The soul of a thing is in the hands that make it, Alistair. I hope you haven't outsourced that too." He left, and I was left alone in my glass tower, feeling a familiar mix of fury and shame. I dismissed his words as the ramblings of an old man, unable to comprehend the new world I was building. I was blind to the fact that he wasn't criticizing my success. He was mourning my direction. That direction was now governed by an insatiable hunger for more. More growth, more market share, more acclaim. Being a celebrated luxury brand wasn't enough. I looked at the vast middle market, the millions of consumers who aspired to luxury but couldn't afford it, and I saw a field ripe for conquest. That was the birthplace of the most catastrophic idea of my career. I called it C-Urban. It was to be a diffusion line, a cheaper, more accessible version of Caldwell. The bags would be made not of Italian full-grain leather, but of lower-grade hides and synthetics. The hardware wouldn't be hand-cast brass, but mass-produced zinc alloy. The manufacturing wouldn't be in our English workshops, but in enormous factories in Asia. It would bear a simplified version of our name, leveraging the prestige we had spent decades building to sell a product that had none of our DNA. When I announced the plan to my executive team, the room was divided. The new blood, the sharp-suited MBAs I'd hired for their aggressive growth strategies, saw it as a brilliant move. They produced charts and graphs, projecting exponential revenue growth. But the old guard, the men and women who had been with me since the early days, were horrified. My head of design, a man named Michael who had worked alongside my father, looked at the prototypes with utter contempt. "Alistair, this is poison," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't Caldwell, this is a cheap imitation. You put our name on this, and you tell the world that everything we stand for, quality, longevity, craftsmanship, is negotiable. You will devalue the core brand overnight." His words struck a nerve, but my ego was a fortress. How could they question my vision? I was the one who had taken us this far. They were living in the past, just like my father. "You don't understand scale, Michael," I said, my voice cold and dismissive. "This is how we become a billion-dollar company. This is how we secure our future. We are either a predator or we are prey." He just shook his head and resigned a week later. Several other senior members of the original team followed him. I saw their departure not as a warning, but as a necessary shedding of old skin, making way for a newer, more streamlined organization that shared my singular vision. The C-Urban initiative would require an astronomical capital investment, new supply chains, a massive marketing budget, new distribution channels. The company was profitable, but we didn't have that kind of cash on hand. My new CFO, a slick and ambitious man named Julian, proposed a solution. We would take out the largest loan in the company's history, a 9-figure sum from a consortium of investment banks. It was a staggering amount of debt. To secure a loan of that magnitude, there was only one thing we could offer as collateral: the entire parent company, Caldwell Fine Leathers, my grandfather's legacy, my father's life's work, my entire empire. Julian presented it as a simple formality, a standard procedure for a company of our size making a bold strategic move. I sat in that sterile boardroom, the loan agreement stretching across the polished mahogany table like a death shroud. It was hundreds of pages of dense legal text. I didn't read it, not really. I skimmed the key figures, listened to Julian's confident assurances, and saw only the glittering prize at the end. I saw myself on the cover of Fortune magazine. I saw Caldwell becoming a household name, on the same level as the corporate titans I idolized. The warnings from my father and from Michael echoed faintly in the back of my mind, but they were drowned out by the roar of my own ambition. With a gold-plated fountain pen, a gift from a Qatari prince, I signed my name. I signed away the soul of my family's company as security for a gamble born of pure hubris. I signed the papers without a moment's hesitation. It was the first shovelful of dirt I threw onto the coffin of my family's legacy. The launch of C-Urban was a spectacle of calculated extravagance. We threw a launch party in a cavernous, converted warehouse in New York, lit with neon and pulsing with electronic music. We hired A-list celebrities to be photographed holding the new bags, their smiles as synthetic as the polyurethane trim on the products. We papered cities with billboards showing impossibly beautiful people looking effortlessly cool, our new diluted logo emblazoned beside them. From a purely commercial standpoint, the initial rollout was a triumph. The marketing blitz worked. A generation of new, younger consumers, hungry for a piece of the Caldwell prestige at a fraction of the price, flocked to the stores. The first quarter's sales figures for C-Urban were staggering, far exceeding even Julian's most optimistic projections. On paper, I was a genius all over again. The business press lauded my daring and democratic brand extension. Our company's valuation soared. I felt a vindication so potent it was almost dizzying. I had gambled and won. I had proven the doubters, the traditionalists, my own father, spectacularly wrong. I took the celebratory phone calls, accepted the industry awards, and moved through the world encased in a bubble of self-congratulation. I was so high on the fumes of my success that I failed to notice the toxic rot that had begun to fester at the very foundations of my empire. The first sign of trouble came not as a bang, but as a whisper. It started in the customer service department, emails, then phone calls, then a torrent. The complaints were eerily similar. A strap on a C-Urban tote bag had snapped after a week. The gold-plated hardware on a purse was tarnishing, revealing a cheap grey metal beneath. The synthetic leather on a backpack was peeling at the corners. These weren't the isolated quality control issues of a premium product. This was a systemic failure of a fundamentally inferior one. My new head of operations, a man I'd hired for his expertise in cutting supply chain costs, assured me these were just teething problems, statistically insignificant in a launch of this scale. I chose to believe him. Admitting the product was flawed would be admitting that Michael and my father had been right. My ego couldn't afford that admission. So, instead of addressing the root cause, the shoddy materials and rushed manufacturing, I decided the problem was one of perception. We doubled down, we threw more money at the fire. We hired an army of social media influencers to post curated, flawless images of themselves with their C-Urban bags, flooding the internet with a counter-narrative of effortless style. We sponsored fashion weeks and music festivals, making the brand ubiquitous. My strategy was no longer about quality, but about volume and noise. I believed that if I could shout loud enough, I could drown out the growing chorus of dissatisfied customers. But the whispers grew into a roar. Product returns skyrocketed. Online forums filled with pictures of our crumbling products, scathing reviews and accusations of a classic bait and switch. The brand that had once been a byword for enduring quality was now becoming a meme for expensive junk. And then the poison began to seep upward, infecting the parent brand. Long-time customers of Caldwell Fine Leathers, the ones who had paid thousands for our artisanal products, started to feel betrayed. They saw the cheap knockoffs bearing a version of our name and felt their own investment had been devalued. The exclusivity and prestige that were the very essence of our core brand began to evaporate. Why pay a premium for a Caldwell briefcase when the name was now associated with peeling pleather? Our flagship boutiques, once serene sanctuaries of luxury, saw a noticeable drop in foot traffic. The old money clientele who had been the bedrock of our business began to quietly drift away to our competitors, brands that hadn't sold their souls for market share. The financial reports became a strange, schizophrenic document. The C Urban line was still generating massive revenue, a huge number at the top of the page, but further down the true story was emerging. The enormous marketing spend, the staggering cost of customer returns and replacements, and the slow, steady decline in sales of our high-margin luxury goods meant that our net profit was shrinking alarmingly. We were a bigger company than ever, but we were becoming a less profitable one. We were a magnificent, colossal ship, taking on water below the waterline, all while the captain was on the deck, celebrating the speed at which we were sinking. My personal life began to mirror the decay in my business. My obsession with the C Urban crisis consumed me. I was working 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a desperate, gnawing anxiety. I was a ghost in my own home. My wife, Eleanor, tried to reach me. She would attempt to talk to me over dinner in our cavernous, silent dining room, her voice echoing in the space between us. She spoke of our children's school plays I'd missed, of family friends I no longer saw, of the man I used to be, the passionate, driven man who still had a light in his eyes. Now, she said, all she saw was a haunted calculator. "Alistair, this business is eating you alive," she pleaded one night. "It's not just about leather and money anymore. It's killing you. It's killing us." I heard her words as an attack, as another voice of doubt I needed to silence. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," I snapped back. "I'm holding this entire thing together." The truth was, I was the one tearing it apart. The breaking point arrived in the form of David, my chief financial officer, not Julian, the architect of the loan, but his predecessor. David had been with the company for 20 years. He was my father's hire, a quiet, meticulous accountant who I had kept on for his institutional knowledge. He wasn't a risk-taker or a visionary. He was a man of numbers, and the numbers were his religion. He requested an urgent, private meeting. He came into my office, closing the door behind him, and laid a single, thick report on my desk. He didn't sit down. "Alistair," he began, his voice steady but grave. "I've run the numbers independently of Julian's team. I've factored in the return rates, the warranty claims, the declining margins on the core brand, and our current debt service obligations." He paused, taking a deep breath. "We are burning cash at a catastrophic rate. The revenue from C Urban is masking a terminal illness in our balance sheet. The machine is eating itself. If we continue on this exact trajectory, without a radical course correction, we will default on our loan covenants in 6 months. The banks will take everything." I stared at the report, at the columns of black and red ink. The numbers were screaming a truth I had refused to see, but accepting that truth meant accepting my own failure on a scale I couldn't comprehend. It was a choice between a painful reality and a comforting lie. I chose the lie. I looked up from the report and into David's worried, honest eyes, and in that moment, I didn't see a loyal employee trying to save me from myself. I saw a traitor, an obstacle, another part of the old world that was trying to hold me back. My fear manifested as rage. "Your analysis is flawed," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You're a relic, David. You don't have the stomach for this level of play. You see problems, Julian sees solutions." "This isn't about vision, Alistair," he pleaded. "This is just math." "Then your math is wrong," I concluded, my voice rising. "I think your time here is done. Pack your things." The look of shock and profound hurt on his face is something that will haunt me for the rest of my days. He simply nodded, turned, and walked out of my life forever. I had fired the one man who was telling me the unvarnished truth. It was the worst decision of my entire professional career, a fatal act of self-preservation that sealed my fate. But, as I would soon discover, it was far from being my last. Firing David was like removing the final brake from a runaway train. With his dissenting voice silenced, I surrounded myself entirely with an echo chamber of my own making. Julian, my ambitious CFO, was promoted, his influence now unchecked. The boardroom, once a place of robust debate, became a theatre of sycophantic agreement. My narrative was the only one permitted. We were in a temporary trough, a period of strategic investment that would soon yield unprecedented returns. Anyone who hinted otherwise was branded a pessimist, a naysayer who lacked the fortitude for our bold new reality. I had constructed a world where my delusions were reinforced as strategic brilliance, and I was its willing king. The 6-month timeline that David had warned me about began to tick like a bomb in the back of my mind, a persistent anxiety I refused to acknowledge in the light of day. Outwardly, I projected an aura of unshakable confidence. I gave interviews to financial journals, speaking in grand terms about market disruption and paradigm shifts, using a lexicon of corporate jargon designed to obscure the simple, terrifying truth. The company was bleeding out. Internally, however, a quiet panic had begun to set in. The rosy projections Julian had made to justify the C-Urban expansion were failing to materialize. The profit margins were thinner than paper, and the debt service payments were a ravenous beast, devouring colossal chunks of our operational cash flow every quarter. It was Julian who came to me with the solution. He presented it not as a desperate gamble, but as a sophisticated financial maneuver, a way to unlock dormant value and optimize our capital assets. He came into my office late one evening, his eyes gleaming with the kind of manic energy I now recognize as the hallmark of a cornered man. He spread a series of complex charts across my desk, filled with arrows and acronyms that meant very little to me. I was a man who understood leather, stitching, and brand identity. This was the arcane language of high finance, a world in which I was a tourist, and he was my all-too-confident guide. The proposal, stripped of its bewildering terminology, was terrifyingly simple. He suggested we take a significant portion of the company's remaining liquid capital, the money we used for payroll, for suppliers, for keeping the lights on, and move it into speculative, high-yield investments. He spoke of currency derivatives, commodities futures, and leveraged hedge funds. These were instruments designed for immense risk and potentially immense reward. His logic was that our core business was in a slump. It couldn't generate the cash we needed to cover our debts and fund our operations. Therefore, we had to make our money work for us in the financial markets. "It's a short-term bridge, Alistair," he explained, his voice a soothing baritone of pure confidence. "We find the right play, we generate a 20 or 30% return in a single quarter, and we shore up the balance sheet. We buy ourselves another year. By then, C-Urban will have stabilized and we'll be clear." The sane part of my brain, the vestigial remnant of my father's prudence, screamed that this was madness. This was taking the company's lifeblood and pouring it onto a roulette table. It was the financial equivalent of a Hail Mary pass. But my pride was a powerful anesthetic. To reject Julian's plan would be to admit David had been right. It would mean admitting that my grand vision was a failure, that I had steered the ship directly into an iceberg. The alternative, this one miraculous high-stakes play, offered a seductive possibility: redemption. It was a chance not just to save the company, but to prove once and for all that I was smarter than everyone who had doubted me. I could erase all my mistakes with one brilliant, audacious move. My ego needed that victory more than the company needed the money. My family, by this point, was living on a different planet. My wife, Eleanor, had stopped trying to talk to me about the business. Our conversations had been reduced to strained pleasantries about the weather, and our children, who were now young adults I barely knew. I was a stranger in my own home, a fleeting presence moving between my gilded cage of a house and my glass tower of an office. I remember my son Thomas, home from university, trying to show me a project he was working on, a beautifully crafted leather wallet he had made by hand, using some of my grandfather's old tools that he'd found in storage. He had the old Caldwell talent in his hands. He looked up at me with such pride, hoping for a word of encouragement. I barely glanced at it. "That's nice, son," I mumbled, my mind 1,000 miles away, churning over currency fluctuations and market volatility. The look of disappointment on his face was a small, sharp pain that I quickly buried under a mountain of more pressing anxieties. I was losing everything that mattered, chasing a victory that was already lost. The world outside my self-imposed bubble was flashing warning signs. Financial news channels were filled with nervous chatter about a housing bubble in the United States, about subprime mortgages, and over-leveraged financial institutions. Pundits warned of a potential global correction. I dismissed it all as background noise, the perpetual fear-mongering of a media that thrived on crisis. Julian assured me our positions were insulated, managed by the brightest minds on the street. He said that volatility was an opportunity for the bold. We convinced ourselves that we were the smart money, the ones who could dance between the raindrops while everyone else got soaked. We were geniuses after all. The world had told us so. The final decision was made on a Tuesday night. Julian brought the paperwork to my office. It was a series of wire transfer authorizations, moving tens of millions of dollars, the heart of our company's operational funds, from our secure corporate accounts to a Cayman Islands-based hedge fund that specialized in high-risk, high-reward derivative trading. This was the point of no return. I held the pen over the signature line, and for a fleeting moment, I saw my grandfather's face. I saw him in his dusty workshop, his hands stained with dye, meticulously burnishing the edge of a leather belt. A lifetime of tangible, honest work. I was about to convert that legacy into a series of digital bits, a bet on a financial abstraction I didn't truly understand. It was a profound and obscene betrayal, but the roar of my pride was louder than the whisper of my conscience. I needed to win. I needed to silence the ghost of my father, the memory of David's warning, the creeping dread in my own gut. "Are you absolutely certain about this fund, Julian?" I asked one last time, seeking not genuine reassurance, but permission. "Alistair," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, his voice a perfect blend of camaraderie and conviction. "This is how titans play the game. In 3 months, we'll be laughing about how worried we were." I took a deep breath and signed my name. I pushed the papers across the desk. I had done it. I had just bet the house, the farm, and the family graves on a single spin of the wheel. At that moment, I ceased to be a builder. Like my father and his father before him, I had become a gambler, and the croupier had just called, "No more bets." For a few weeks, an unnerving quiet settled over everything. The roulette wheel was spinning, and all I could do was wait. I went through the motions of running a global corporation, but it was a pantomime. My focus was elsewhere, fixed on the financial market tickers that scrolled endlessly across a dedicated monitor on my desk. I feigned interest in meetings about marketing campaigns and seasonal product lines, while my mind was consumed by the cryptic dance of futures pricing and currency pairings. I was a man holding his breath, waiting for a tidal wave that was either going to lift me to the heavens or obliterate me completely. And that wave was coming. Before I tell you how it broke and swept everything away, if you followed me this far into the storm, please consider subscribing to the channel. And I need to ask you, looking back at this wreckage, what do you think was my single greatest error? Was it the initial greed, the suffocating ego, or was it placing my trust in the wrong people? I genuinely want to read your perspective in the comments below. The catalyst, when it came, wasn't a single event but a rapid-fire succession of hammer blows, a global financial contagion that began half a world away. A major investment bank in New York, a name that had been synonymous with stability for over a century, collapsed overnight. Its failure was due to its massive exposure to the very subprime mortgage derivatives that had been the subject of nervous whispers for months. The news sent a shockwave of pure panic through the international markets. Credit markets froze, liquidity vanished. What had been a nervous correction turned into an outright headlong crash. It was a financial heart attack, and the fund where I had parked my company's soul was located directly in the epicenter. I remember that morning with a chilling, surreal clarity. I was in my office when Julian burst in, his face ashen, his usual slick confidence utterly vaporized. He didn't even speak. He just pointed a trembling finger at the television screen mounted on the wall. A news anchor was speaking in urgent, apocalyptic tones about a systemic meltdown. The name of our hedge fund scrolled across the bottom of the screen, listed among dozens of others facing catastrophic losses and imminent margin calls. A cold dread, heavier and more absolute than anything I had ever felt, began to seep into my bones. The phone rang. It was the fund manager, his voice strained and cracking over a bad connection. He spoke in a rapid-fire burst of financial jargon, but the message was brutally simple. They had been over-leveraged. The market's collapse had triggered their margin calls. To cover their positions, they had to liquidate everything, including our investment. But in a panic-selling market, there were no buyers. The value of our holdings had not just decreased, it had evaporated. It was gone. All of it. The tens of millions of dollars that were supposed to be our salvation had vanished into a black hole of financial panic. Worse, due to the leveraged nature of the positions, there was a shortfall. We didn't just lose our entire investment, we now owed the fund an additional 8-figure sum we did not have. The news didn't register at first. My brain simply couldn't process it. It was a number so vast, a loss so total, that it felt like an abstraction. I just stared at the silent phone in my hand after the call ended. Then the second wave hit. The news of our fund's collapse must have instantly alerted our own creditors. The private line on my desk, the one reserved for our primary investment bank, began to ring. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, insistently. I knew what the call was about. Our loan agreement, the one I had signed so arrogantly without reading the fine print, contained covenants, clauses that were triggered by a material adverse change in our financial position. The loss of our entire operating capital was about the most material and adverse change imaginable. Julian was pacing the office like a caged animal, muttering, "This wasn't supposed to happen. The models didn't predict this." I looked at this man, this architect of my ruin, and I felt nothing. No anger, no desire for retribution. Just a vast, empty numbness. We were two fools who had believed our own hype, and the real world had just called our bluff in the most brutal way possible. The days that followed were a descent into a bureaucratic hell. The bank officially called our loan. The entire sum was due immediately. We had no cash to pay it. Therefore, they exercised their rights under the collateral agreement. They seized the company. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a repossession, as cold and impersonal as a bailiff taking a television set. Men in sharp suits, lawyers and receivers from the bank, arrived at our headquarters. They were polite, efficient, and utterly implacable. They were there to dismantle my life's work and sell it for parts to recoup their losses. The process of losing everything was a series of small, deep humiliations that chipped away at my soul. There was the phone call I had to make to my head of manufacturing, a man who had worked for my father, to tell him that the factories were to be shuttered, effective immediately. I could hear the stunned silence, then the anguish in his voice as he asked, "What about my people, Alistair? Some of them have been with us for 40 years. I had no answer. There was the meeting with the board, where I had to formally tender my resignation from the company that bore my name. I was an emperor, handing over the keys to a kingdom already in flames. The news broke publicly. "Caldwell Leathers collapses under mountain of debt," the headline screamed. My face was plastered everywhere, no longer the visionary CEO but the poster child for corporate hubris and catastrophic failure. The myth I had so carefully constructed was dismantled overnight, replaced by a much harsher and more accurate truth. The friends who had flocked to my lavish parties and eagerly sought my company suddenly had full schedules. My calls went unanswered. The influence I thought I commanded, the respect I believed I had earned, were revealed to be nothing more than byproducts of my net worth. Without the money, I was a pariah. The personal fallout was just as swift and brutal. The receivers put a lien on all my personal assets, which had been cross-collateralized against the loans. The mansion, the art collection, the fleet of cars, all of it was seized. I remember standing in the marble hallway of my home as men with clipboards tagged every piece of furniture for auction. Eleanor stood beside me, her face a mask of quiet grief, not for the things, but for the finality of it all. We were given 48 hours to vacate the premises. The last thing to go was the jet. As I signed the final transfer papers, I thought of my father's simple question all those years ago in my glass tower. Where do you make things? In the end, I hadn't made anything that truly lasted. I had built a house of cards on a foundation of debt and ego, and the first strong wind had blown it all away. The final scene of my old life took place in a small, sterile lawyer's office. I was declaring personal bankruptcy. I sat at a cheap laminate table and signed away the last vestiges of my former life. I walked out of that building with nothing but the clothes on my back and a single, well-worn Caldwell wallet in my pocket, one my grandfather had made 50 years earlier. It was empty. I stood on the pavement, the city noise buzzing around me, a completely anonymous man. I had no car, no home, no company. The empire of Alistair Caldwell was officially extinct. I had reached the absolute bottom, a place so desolate and empty that for the first time in years I could finally hear the silence. The immediate aftermath of the collapse wasn't a dramatic storm, it was a profound and suffocating emptiness. The frantic chaos of bankruptcy proceedings and liquidation sales gave way to a deafening silence. There were no more urgent calls, no more board meetings, no more fawning assistants. My calendar, once a complex tapestry of international flights and high-stakes negotiations, was now a blank page. For the first time in 3 decades, I woke up in the morning with absolutely nothing to do and nowhere to be. The identity I had so painstakingly built, Alistair Caldwell, the titan of industry, had been pulverized, and I wasn't sure who, if anyone, was left in the rubble. We moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment that my son, Thomas, rented for us. After living in a house where rooms were so vast you could shout and not be heard, the sheer proximity of this new life was a shock. I could hear the television from the neighboring apartment through the thin walls. I could smell what the person downstairs was cooking for dinner. It was an intimacy with the mundane world that I hadn't experienced since I was a child. In the beginning, it felt like a prison. The shame was a physical weight. I rarely left the apartment during the day, terrified of being recognized, of seeing the pity or scorn in a stranger's eyes. I would watch the business news on television, a form of self-flagellation, seeing other men I once called peers, discuss the new world order that was rising from the ashes of the financial crisis, a crisis I had so spectacularly failed to navigate. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape. I would lie awake for hours, my mind a relentless cinema of my past mistakes. I'd see David's wounded face as I fired him. I'd hear my father's gentle warnings about the soul of the business. I'd feel the cold weight of the fountain pen in my hand as I signed the loan agreements. It was a highlight reel of my own arrogance playing on an endless loop. I was a 70-year-old man in a rented room, haunted by the ghost of the man I had been at 40, 50, and 60. I expected Eleanor to leave me. By any reasonable measure, she had every right to. I had squandered our security, ignored her for years, and dragged her into a public humiliation of staggering proportions. I had given her a life of immense luxury and then, just as quickly, snatched it away. I braced myself for the inevitable conversation, the final, deserved abandonment, but it never came. Instead, she did something I hadn't seen her do in years. She sat with me. Not in the performative way we had sat through charity galas and corporate dinners, but truly with me. She would sit in the quiet of our small living room, saying nothing, simply being a presence in the void. One afternoon, finding me staring blankly out the window, she came and stood beside me. She put her hand on my arm. "It's just money, Alistair," she said softly. "We lost things. We didn't lose us." Her grace was a lifeline. It was a gift I knew I hadn't earned. Slowly, tentatively, my children also began to bridge the chasm I had created between us. My daughter, who had felt more like a stranger to me than my own personal assistant, started visiting on weekends, bringing groceries, and my son, Thomas, the one whose handmade wallet I had so carelessly dismissed, began to spend his evenings with me. He wouldn't talk about the collapse or the money. Instead, he would ask me about my grandfather. He'd ask about the old tools, about how to properly skive an edge on a piece of leather, about the specific tanning process my grandfather had favored. He was asking me about the one part of my life that was still pure, the foundation I had built an empire on before I had decided to poison it. One evening, he brought over a box of old tools he had salvaged from one of the workshop auctions. They were my grandfather's, the worn wooden handles shaped by decades of his grasp, the steel heads bearing the nicks and scratches of a lifetime of honest work. Thomas laid them out on the small dining table. "Show me," he said. "Show me how he used to do it." Hesitantly, I picked up a familiar swivel knife. My hands, which had grown soft and accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a pen, felt clumsy and foreign. But as I drew the blade across a scrap of leather Thomas had brought, something deep within me stirred. A muscle memory, dormant for 30 years, began to awaken. The scent of the cut hide was like a key, unlocking a door to a room I thought had been sealed forever. That night was the beginning of my reconstruction, not of my fortune, but of myself. We started working together at that small table. I taught Thomas everything my father had taught me, and his father before him. We worked in silence mostly, the only sounds being the rhythmic tap of the mallet, the slide of the awl through leather, the quiet scrape of the burnishing tool. In that focused manual work, I found a kind of peace that had eluded me for my entire adult life. There were no balance sheets, no market projections, no egos. There was only the material in my hands and the desire to make it into something honest and beautiful. We weren't building a brand. We were just making a wallet, and then a belt, and then a small handbag for Eleanor. Each finished piece was a small act of redemption. This is where I finally understood the fundamental lesson that had cost me $100 million empire to learn. Money, I realized, is an amplifier. It doesn't create character. It simply reveals it in high definition. If you are generous, it will make you a philanthropist. If you are insecure, it will make you ostentatious. In my case, I was ambitious and deeply insecure, terrified of being seen as the son who simply inherited a small business and did nothing with it. The money amplified that ambition into a blinding hubris, and that insecurity into a desperate need for external validation. I became so obsessed with the scoreboard, the magazine covers, the valuation, the size of the company, that I forgot what the game was even about. My grandfather and my father understood it. The purpose wasn't to be the biggest, it was to be the best. The reward was the integrity of the object itself, not the price tag it could command. I lost my empire, but I found my family. I lost my status, but I found my purpose, a purpose that had been waiting for me all along in that dusty workshop of my childhood. The true value of a man is not measured by what he accumulates, but by what he has left when everything he has accumulated is taken away. When I was stripped of everything, I discovered what was truly mine. The love of my wife, the respect of my children, and a skill in my hands that no bankruptcy court could ever repossess. Today, my life is small, and it is profoundly rich. Thomas and I have a little workshop set up in his garage. We take bespoke orders one at a time. People find us through word of mouth. We don't have a marketing budget or a global strategy. Our business plan is to make the next piece better than the last. Sometimes a customer will bring in an old Caldwell bag from 20 or 30 years ago for a repair, a relic from the golden age of my former company. I'll take it in my hands, and I can feel the quality, the integrity we once had. It's a painful reminder of what I lost, but it's also a benchmark for what I'm trying to rebuild, not in scale, but in spirit. I am no longer a millionaire, and I will never be one again. But when I sit in that quiet garage, with the smell of leather in the air and my son working beside me, I feel a sense of wealth that my private jet and my glass tower could never provide. That is my story. It's a lesson that cost me everything to learn. If it resonated with you in any way, I ask you to please share this video with someone who might need to hear this message. And for my final question to you, what is the single greatest lesson that money or the lack of it has ever taught you? I look forward to reading every one of your answers. Thank you for listening.